Okay, so we are continuing on with plant parts, and today we're looking specifically at flowers. Okay, now flowers are, as we probably all know, a really cool part of plants, and really often, I think that flowers are the plant part that generally really resonates with people, and frankly, it probably attracts the majority of people that are into horticulture. It attracts them to horticulture because flowers are so showy and so amazing. Let's start with, what is a flower? I think this came from Oxford Dictionary or something. The seed-bearing part of a plant consisting of reproductive organs, being stamens and carpels, that are typically surrounded by brightly colored corolla or petals and green calyx or sepals. Okay, so flowers are essentially reproductive organs, and the reason they're so colorful and so interesting is generally because they are trying to attract something to it to pollinate it. Okay, so between the colors, guidelines, scent, all of those things are attracting pollinators. Okay, so what we see here, a couple pictures of some of my favorites. I mean, gotta admit, I'm not the hugest rose fan in general. I don't dislike them, but they're not like my favorite, right? They are beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Rose flowers are beautiful. There's a lot of different types, but they are a very prized flower for a lot of reasons. Here we have a pincushion protea, okay, Leucodendron cordifolia. And we'll look at this one a little bit more in depth later on in this presentation. We have a hellebore hybrid here. Now, hellebores or Lenten roses, very cool plants, gorgeous flowers, great for cut flowers. And I really like using these in landscapes because they come into bloom in late winter, much earlier than almost all other plants. So there's these really great shows that you can get out of plants, out of these plants, and sort of an abnormal period of the seasons. Okay. Here we've got our Eschscholtzia californica. This is California poppy. And then in the lower area there, you see a grass-like plant. This is Syrinchium bellum, which is blue-eyed grass. I feel like I talked about blue-eyed grass in the monocots presentation, but so a couple natives here to California. So yes, flowers are amazing, and they really appeal to, well, I was going to say humans, but they really appeal to animals, right? Um, uh, Insects, right? They are the main pollinating uh, animal out there are insects, and really generally they plants evolve to attract insects primarily. There's a lot of different pollinators out there, but they evolve to attract insects through color, guidelines, and scents. Okay, and again, a flower is the seed bearing part of the plant. A couple other flowers. Okay, now these are flowers that I really appreciate. These are all California natives. This one here, top picture is the whole plant, bottom picture is the flower only. This is Rhamnia culturi. This is the Matilaha poppy. Great plant, really good for erosion control, spreads pretty vigorously. That's why it's so darn good for erosion control. And has a giant fried egg looking flower, just absolutely huge. These are typically about 6 to 8 inches across. Okay. Next one we see here, a little bit different. Okay, this is Ceanothus. I'm not sure what Ceanothus this is. I'm guessing that this is a hybrid. I'm guessing that it's Ceanothus concha. Oh no, this is Thyraciflua. And then this is the actual flower itself. Okay, and this isn't a flower. This is a bunch of flowers. Okay, and it's a certain type of flower arrangement or form. Okay, now this next one, this is actually one of my favorite plants to use. Very interesting little plant. This one is called Carpentaria californica, or bush anemone. The reason it's called bush anemone is because the flower itself is very much like an anemone flower, which is a really cool perennial flower. There's hybrids, there's anemone japonica, there's many different types, but the flower itself looks very much like an anemone. Now, this plant here is actually it's a, like I said, it's a very interesting plant. There we go. I'm just going to jump onto Calscape really quick here so that I can share this out. So this is a California native, and I'm going to zip this on over here. California native right here. And its distribution is super limited, incredibly limited. Okay. Now we've got Fresno here. We've got Shaver Lake. Huntington Lake is up there somewhere. I've spent a decent amount of time up in this area. It's a beautiful area of the Southern Sierras. But this is its natural distribution. So if you look at this, right, like that's the only spot that this plant naturally occurs. It's actually in the hydrangea family. Very cool plant. Anyways, that is one of the plants and flowers that I really, really love. So just a couple examples of some flowers. Now, let's dive in and look at a flower itself, what the parts are specifically. And then we'll go through, actually, you guys will watch a video that will go through the fertilization process. So we're going to look at what the parts of a flower are, number one. And then we're going to go in through some different types of flowers, flower arrangements, and then look at some specific flowers and their arrangement and sort of identifying the parts of those. Okay, so here we have a cross section of a flower. Parts, we have a sepal. Okay, sepal is basically a modified leaf, okay, and it's a protective portion of the flower. It protects the very important stuff, which is the ovule and receptacle. Next one, and this is generally the one that people associate with flowers, which is appropriate, 100% appropriate, but a lot of times, just like when we looked at the bougainvillea, you know, people will associate the very colorful part of a flower with being a petal, which generally it is, but many times it's not. Okay, so the petal itself, we have the male portions of the flower, okay, the stamen. The stamen is the entire structure. The anther, which is the portion which produces pollen, and the filament, okay, which is essentially the stalk that the anther sits on, and combined, the filament holding the anther is the stamen. Now we have the pistil, okay? And this is really the female portion of the flower. And we'll get to this, but not all flowers, not all plants have flowers that have both female and male parts. Okay, sometimes they're on different flowers, or sometimes they're on different flowers, or they're on different plants, male and female plants. And then sometimes they switch it up. Okay. And we'll get into the sometimes they switch it up later when we get into male and female portions of plants, and then imperfect and perfect flowers, because there's some total oddballs out there that you already know these plants, but you may not have known, hey, there's this really interesting thing that happens with this plant. Okay. So back to pistil. On the top, there is the stigma. There's the style, which essentially holds the stigma up proud, generally in a fashion that is able to easily receive a piece of pollen. Okay, so that piece of pollen can fertilize the ovule that sits within the receptacle through the pollen tube. Okay, so these are all the very simple parts of flowers. And it's important to recognize, just like with leaves, monocots and dicots, the different parts of plants, we look at identifying characteristics. And again, this is a flower that has both male and female parts. And we look at this so that we start to understand what those parts are on the flower or within the flower, that we can identify its characteristics, and then it helps us to be able to identify the plant itself. Similar, okay, but different layout. So again, we've got the petal, we have the sepal, we have the receptacle, the ovule, the style, and the stigma. And remember, that makes up, between the ovary, the style, and the stigma, that makes up the pistil. And then we have the anther and the filament, which together make up the stamen. So petals. Petals are used to attract insects into the flower. They may have guidelines in them and be scented. Okay, so that petal is really, again, it's the colorful portion, right? The part that attracts animals to it. Humans, it attracts humans because we look at things and for whatever reason, we really appreciate beautiful things. And the petals are typically the piece of the plant or the part of the plant that is very attractive. Also, clearly very attractive to insects. And this mention here, they may have guidelines in them to guide the insects to where the pollen can rub off on that insect and then find a stigma, right? So there may be some guidelines on that petal. Maybe a lot of times when you see guidelines on petals, that anther, it is there, but sometimes it's on a flower that the filament is very, very short. And so the anthers are kind of tucked way down. And so that plant has evolved to have guidelines to direct a pollinator down to the anther. Okay, so interesting pieces there. And sometimes, of course, they are scented. The stigma is covered in a sticky substance that pollen grains will adhere to. Okay, so that stigma has a little sticky substance on it so that when pollen grains, whether it's deposited by a pollinating insect or animal or the wind, okay, generally those stigmas will have some sort of stickiness to them that will attract or that will uh, uh, be able to get a pollen grain to stick onto it. The style raises the stigma away from the ovary to decrease the likelihood of pollen contamination. Okay, and it varies in length. So that style here, okay, so varies in length. It pulls it up to a certain degree so that it can get pollinated easily, but it also is so that uh, that other so that it separates the ovary from the opening of the pollen tube, so that it can decrease the likelihood of pollen contamination. The ovary protects the ovule, and once fertilization has taken place, it will become the fruit. And then the ovule is basically like the egg in animals, and once fertilization has taken place, it will become the seed. So the ovary protects the ovule, and after fertilization, it becomes the fruit. The ovule, which is protected by the ovary, once fertilization takes place, it will become the seed. The filament is like the stalk to the anther. Okay, and remember, combined, it is the stamen, filament, anther. Together, it is the stamen. And the anther itself contains pollen sacs. The sacs release pollen onto the outside of the anthers that brush against insects on entering the flowers. And once the pollen has been deposited on the insect, it is transferred to the stigma of another flower, and the ovule is then able to be fertilized. So those male parts of the flower are the stamen. Remember, it's the anther, which contains the pollen sacs that is held up proud by the filament. And then the female parts are combined, considered the pistil, the stigma, which is at the top that receives the pollen grain and has the stickiness on it, the style that raises the stigma up above the ovary to receive pollen, but also to protect the ovary or the ovule from pollen contamination. Two different types of flowers, perfect or imperfect. An imperfect flower is a flower that has either all male parts or all female parts. Examples of this are cucumbers, pumpkin, melons, okay, the cucurbits, this gourds. Perfect flowers are flowers that have both male and female parts on the same flower. Okay, and examples of these are roses, lilies, dandelions, etc. Okay, so there are some flowers that have both male and female parts in the same flower, and this is an example. Okay, they're going to have the stamen and pistil. Okay, now imperfect flowers. So a perfect flower Sorry for the zipping around here. A perfect flower. This is an example of a perfect flower. An imperfect flower is either going to have stamens or pistils. Now on to identification characteristics of flowers. I'll have to post. So I'll post the link. So by the time you're watching this, there's already going to be a link posted in the module page that you found this on, this video on. A link to where I pulled these pictures from, and so that you can read a little bit more about it. So looking at identification characteristics, again, some of the identification characteristics are going to be in the characteristics of the stamen, anther and filament, characteristics of the pistil, stigma, style, ovary, the sepal, the petal, so all of the parts, right? So you may see a flower that has a very short filament to it, right? Or very large anthers. Okay, so those are identifying characteristics there. Other ways to identify plants are going to be just simply in the flower shape. Flower shapes being funnels, salverform, trumpet, rosette, pom-pom, tubular. Okay, so like fuchsias are tubular. Trumpet vines are trumpet shaped flowers, but also a lot of other flowers have trumpet-like shapes, but they're not giant flowers like the trumpet vine. Okay, so lots of different types of flower shapes. There's also different petal arrangements, being single petals, recurved petals or recurved petal arrangements, reflexed petal arrangements, double, semi-double, fully double. And we see a lot of these characteristics, even just, I think we talked about camellia, right? The Camellia japonica. Even just in camellias, you see that there are singles, semi-doubles, doubles, fully double, right? So just in different cultivated varieties, we're seeing differences in petal arrangements. Now, one really good way to look at, or good thing to look at for plant identification and flower identification is the inflorescence. Okay, so the arrangement of the flowers on a plant. So this one here, we have a solitary. This one here, we've got a flower head. So there's a lot of flowers that are essentially all within this. We've got an umbel where there are, so in the flower head version or inflorescence, there's no stalk. Those flower heads just pop right off of the, essentially adjacent to the base. With the umbel, what you see is that you have a bunch of little flower stalks that arise and then create this umbel. This here is a cluster. Here we have a spike. An example of spikes would be, or spiked inflorescence would be lavender. Cyme, okay, and thistles are typically cymes. There's another one, we'll look at it in a little bit here, that's considered a cyme. There's a corum. Typically, corums have flat tops to them. So St. Catherine's lace, Eriogonum giganteum, has corums. I'll pull that one up. Zippy doo dah day over here. So this is St. Catherine's lace, or Eriogonum giganteum. If you don't already know this plant, I guarantee you have seen this plant. It is a phenomenal plant, California native. It's a buckwheat. And where you've seen this plant typically is on highway hillside cuts. And where you can recognize it, usually you see it when it's rusted. When these flowers are spent, they turn to a rust color, and essentially they'll almost coat entire hillside that just looks super rusty. It's interesting, right? May not be the most attractive thing to a lot of people, but to me it is. It looks cool. But you also, when you see that, you know that that's Eriogonum giganteum. Before those flowers are spent, those are corums, okay, and typically a flat top to them. Panicle, example of a panicle. Let's look up Heuchera. Oh, one of my favorites, Heuchera maxima. Heuchera maxima has panicles. And there we go. That's an example. So coral bells have panicles. Also, flower habit. Okay, so how that flower is presented on the plant or by the plant. Some of them are upright and erect. Some of them are horizontal, being horizontal off of the flower stalk itself or the peduncle. There's nodding, which sort of nods, not completely weeping, but nods off sideways. And then there's pendant, which a fuchsia is pendant-like habit. So let's look at some flower parts of various plants. Here we're looking at lavender, a couple different types of lavender. Okay, so the one on top is both of these, between the Lavandula X intermedia and the Lavandula angustifolia. These are two of my favorite plants. Okay, two of my favorite plants to use. And in terms of lavender, these are really the only lavenders that I design into projects, primarily because it's really easy to maintain. Okay? It's a big deal. It's a big portion of it. Anyways, so Lavandula X intermedia, also called lavandin, common name is lavandin, and then Lavandula angustifolia, which is English lavender. Now, the Lavandula X intermedia, you can tell already, it's a hybrid, and it's a hybrid between English lavender and Portuguese lavender. I think it's Lavandula latifolia is Portuguese, I think. Anyways, what we see here is similar flowers, right? So one of the parent plants, the Lavandula X intermedia, is the angustifolia. So you see this is a spike. Okay, this is a spike. Here's two other types of lavandulas. Lavandula stoichas, which is Spanish lavender, and then Lavandula dentata. Very similar plants, very, very similar plants. Primary difference is in the foliage. The Lavandula dentata has dentate foliage. The margin on it is dentate. Remember, we talked about leaf margins, and that's really the big identifying characteristic. The flowers look similar. These are also spikes, okay? But they're very different than the spikes of the angustifolias and the X intermedias. So before I jump off into like the, looking at the spike and the different flower parts on these plants, which is the next slide, I do want to point out, and this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with flower parts, but I do want to offer some explanation for why it is that I use Lavandula X intermedias and angustifolias as opposed to stoichas and dentatas. Now, stoichas and dentatas, from an overall appearance, beauty, amazing flowers, scent, all of those things, the stoichas, the Spanish lavender, the French lavenders are amazing. Okay, these are beautiful plants, beautiful flowers. But I mentioned a minute ago that the reason I prefer intermedias and angustifolias is because of the ease of maintenance, And so I want to point this out to you so that you understand where I'm coming from on it. So with the intermedias and the angustifolias, you can see that all of those flowers all sort of hover up and off the flower stalk or peduncle in the same region of the plant, on the complete outside of the plant. So this one here is Lavandula X intermedia grosso. It's called fat spike. This might be the same or it might be Provence, but there's a lot of different cultivated varieties. And essentially, a single plant makes somewhat of a hemispherical shape. And that's its general habit, is a hemispherical shape. It's considered sort of a subshrub or a woody herbaceous shrub. Okay, so the base of this is woody, and then as you move further out within the profile of the plant, you get into very herbaceous material, less woody material. And then, so there's this hemisphere in here of foliage. And then when the flowers start, and with angustifolias, they typically begin in sometime in May, and they're in full crazy bloom through the end of May, through June, a little bit into July. The X intermedias start a little bit later and go a little bit longer. But in terms of maintenance on these plants, once they're mature, the only thing that you have to do is cut off all of the flowers plus 2 to 4 inches into the herbaceous foliage, and the entire thing is done. Okay. So no sort of nitpicky deadheading. It is addressing the entire thing, and then you can get the bundles and of lavenders, the satchels, whatever they are. The dentatas and the stoichas, on the other hand, and this is a really good example here with the stoichas, you see that the flowers, the stalk does not come up very high. It's close to the foliage, and then there's a lot of flowers tucked right within the foliage itself, which makes deadheading these very challenging, or I should say very time consuming, to do it properly. Okay, very time consuming to do it properly. So that's the main reason that I much prefer the X intermedias and the angustifolias, is from a maintenance standpoint. I know that if I design these into a landscape, that the chances of them getting maintained properly and at the proper time of year is much higher than stoichas and dentatas. Okay, so now let's move on to, these are the different flowers. So this again is the angustifolia, or the angustifolia, the X intermedia flowers. They are spikes. Okay. And you can see here that here's an illustration of them side by side. We have a spike, a very long spike with the angustifolia and intermedias. With the stoichas and dentatas, you have a very short spike. Okay, you have a very short spike. Now, here you've got a whorl of flowers on this spike. Okay, so it's a whorl of flowers, a whorl of flowers, a whorl of flowers. And within that, you have the different flower parts. Okay, so you're going to have the calyx and the corolla. Remember, the corolla is just a fancy word for petal. Okay. And then you have the fertile bracts and bracteoles and blah, blah, blah. I'm less interested in the bracts and bracteoles, et cetera. It's really the flower parts. So these are both considered spikes, but they look very different. Again, it's got the individual flowers, the calyx, the corolla, or the petal. And then actually on the stoichas and dentata, this top portion that most people would look at this entire arrangement of flowers and say, this is a flower, not a flower spike. They would look at this and say, these are the flower petals. But the reality of it is the flower petals are down in here. And what these are sterile bracts. Okay, so very interesting. Same genus, different species within the same genus. Okay, let's oh, that one popped up again. Why did that pop again? There we go. Ooh, here is Leucospermum cordifolium. Remember we looked at this first slide? This is a yellow one. Sacramento region, these are a little bit more challenging to grow. They don't like the cold quite as much here. Although I have gotten a lot of yellow pincushion flowers to really thrive in the flats of Sacramento, as well as pushing into some pretty cool microclimates in the Roseville area. So this right here is the flower structure of Leucospermum cordifolium. Whoops. Sorry about that. Sorry, I got to pull something up off the side here. Just can't remember where it was. There it is. So to normal people, general public, Joe public, not horticulture people, they'll typically look at this and say, look at that beautiful flower, right? It appears to be a single flower, but it's actually not. It's a composite bloom made up of many, many, many small flowers and colorful bracts. Again, bracts, remember, just like with the bougainvillea, those bracts are the colorful part of the bougainvillea flower, even though it's not a flower, it's a bract. The bright yellow stalks that emulate that come up from the flower head, which you could consider the pins of the pin cushion, are actually the pistils of individual flowers, and each stalk consists of a yellow column called the style. So the style is in there, which supports an identically colored stigma. Okay, so here we've got the style. So sorry, let me back up. The pins of the pin cushions are actually the pistils themselves. Okay, so each stalk consists of a yellow column called a style, and then the that supports an identically colored stigma. Okay, and remember that stigma is the part of the flower that receives the pollen grain. Okay. Now, if we dive in here and get a little bit more close up, we see that so we see that again, we've got the stigma and style. Okay. And then where we find the anthers is actually tucked way down in here, tucked way down in here. And they're essentially tucked under these curving formations that are considered specialized petals. So specialized petals here, specialized petals here. And they got pretty creative with this name. The specialized petals are called tepals. So they just switched the T and the P and came up with a specialized petal called a tepal. Anyways, and there's some little hairs on it you can see, right? So if we cut cross section out here, what we're looking at again, stigma, style. Here coming up, we have anther, and those anthers are covered by these modified petals called tepals. Okay, so that right there. And if we dive in one more time here, we've got female organ, which means that the ovary, ovule, and receptacle is really down in here. Okay, now we go to the male portion. Tucked in here, anthers are in here, and they're covered by this curved shape, 4 different modified petals called tepals. Okay, so that is what makes up the pincushion flower of the Leucospermum cordifolium. Now, I mentioned there's some oddballs out here, right? Let's look at just a couple oddballs. We're going to dive into oddball 1. Let's just look up. These ones are just fun. So we'll look at carnivorous plants. And here we've got pitcher plant, right? So this is pitcher plant. Now, interestingly enough, Dutchman's pipe, California native. Well, one of them is California native. Let's do this. Aristolochia californica, the Dutchman's pipe, California Dutchman's pipe. Looks very similar in structure to the pitcher plant, right? And it used to be thought that these were carnivorous plants. Interestingly enough, it is not a carnivorous plant. Looks like one, and everything points to, hey, this is definitely a carnivorous plant. but it's actually not. So this one's actually very interesting. This one's main pollinating insect is the fungus gnat. So what this does is it has a little juices down in here that attract fungus gnat. The fungus gnat come in, are attracted to it, and they pollinate. But then they fly out, okay? It's not eating the fungus gnat. It's just trying to attract it, and frankly, in a very creative way, so that it can be pollinated. That one always gets me. It's a fascinating one. Now, here's one of those oddball switcheroodles. Avocados. Avocados type A versus type B. I think this one here actually had the best explanation. So, avocados. Generally, when we're buying avocados at the supermarkets or wherever, we're typically buying type A avocados. Type A avocados. Now, type A avocados generally are more oily and flavorful. Okay, so a Hass avocado, the kind of that main avocado that's sold and prized, is a type A avocado. There's obviously a type B avocado. Okay, so if we go through this, type A avocado and type B avocado. And this is the crazy part. Okay. So here's what the avocados do. Those flowers change sexes. So I suppose technically it's going to be considered a perfect flower. However, they do something really strange. Type A avocados in the morning open as female. By the afternoon, it's closed. The next morning, it stays closed. The next afternoon, it opens as male. Same flower. Now, type Bs do something very similar, but they open as female in the afternoon on day 1, and then the morning on day 2. So the next morning, it closes up at night and then opens back up in the morning as a male. Fascinating, right? Like, super interesting to me, right? So that being said, okay, so this is a flower characteristic that is not normal, but very interesting. Now, a lot of people really like avocados. I'm a huge avocado fan. Now, there are some quote unquote self-fertile avocados. You will always get some avocados, but if you're going to plant an avocado tree, you probably want a lot of avocados, not just a couple. So the trick really to growing avocados and making sure that your harvests are potentially high, the trick is, and generally people want to grow type A avocados because they're more flavorful, more oily, etc. The trick is plant as many type A's as you can, given the amount of space that you've got. And then plant one type B. One type B. Now, there are some good tasting type B avocados, but I think anybody could probably attest that type A avocados are just more flavorful and more oily than type Bs. So typically, you're not going to really heavily load your type Bs. You just need one that acts as the fertilization partner for the type A's that you're going for the good fruit on. Okay. So always good to have, if you're going to be growing avocados to actually consume, then having type A and type B is the move. My parents live in on the Central Coast, and in about 20, 25 years ago or so, maybe more, my dad planted 3 Hass avocados and 1 Zatano, I think. Zatano was the type B. He did some consultation. This was before I got into horticulture, so I wasn't paying too much attention. So that's what he did. And within about 15 years, he was in high production, like high. Like he gets so many avocados, it's insane. And they're amazing too. Anyways, after about 15 years, at some point he reached out to me and said, hey, they're just like, I'm not getting very many avocados. I used to get tons of avocados. I'm just not getting very many. And so I said, you have 3 Hass avocados. What else do you got? And he said, well, I had this other avocado, but it just was like not doing that great. And it wasn't like the fruit wasn't that good. So I got rid of it. And whoever he'd originally consulted with, I'm sure, just told him, here's what you need, plant these. But he didn't understand what was behind it and the reasons behind it. And so as soon as he took away his type B, all of a sudden he was getting far less fruit. So I said, Dad, go spend some money on a decent size Zatano or Reed or some other type B avocado and plant it. And sure enough, he did it. Within about 2 seasons, he was back to just full bore production. Okay. Now, while I'm sort of on the subject here, this is actually a good article or blog post or whatever it is. And what it does, so you can see here, it goes through each avocado type. The Hass avocado, it's a type A. And then what you really want to look for is bloom time. Okay, so if you're really trying to set up a combo of a good avocado like backyard orchard or orchard if you want, although Sacramento region is a little bit tough for it. What you want to do again is plant as many type A's as you can because it's going to be the best fruit. Then you want to select and look at which type A's you're selecting. And if we're talking Sacramento region, you can see that Hass are frost sensitive below 32 degrees. And the other problem with Hass in our region, which is a bummer because I see it sold in nurseries all the time. And the other issue with Hass in our region is not only do they not really like the more extreme cold that we tend to get in the wintertime, but they're also less heat tolerant. Okay. So really cold in the winter, too cold for the Hass. Probably will make it without crazy frost damage. But then in the summer, it gets really hot here. Okay. So it makes it so that Hass avocados have a little bit of a challenging existence in our region. Whereas Lamb Hass, they can go down to 30 degrees. Carmen Hass go down to 30 degrees. And both of these are more heat tolerant than the Hass themselves, and they're a little bit smaller. They have a little bit smaller fruit, but in terms of the flavor of the fruit, it's almost spot on Hass flavor. Okay, so pick the right type A avocado, and multiple's fine. But then you also, and this is what I like about this post, is that it tells you the bloom time. So you want those that type A that you select and the type B that you select to be blooming at the same time. So if you're going to go with some Lamb Hass, their bloom time is late winter to spring. The next thing you do is say, okay, well, what is my partner for that Lamb Hass? And so you're going to get down into the type Bs, and made in November, late winter to spring. There might be a little bit of crossover with the Fuerte. The Bacon, late winter to spring. Boom. There you go. And the bacon is cold hardy down to 24 to 26, right? So, in terms of coming up with what avocado you want, and I'm sorry I'm off on a tangent about avocados here, that started really, you know, in my defense, it started with talking about flowers, but it's always a good opportunity to side note here. Anyways, that's what you want to look for. So if you want to check this out, Homestead and Chill. This is actually, I've looked this up in so many different ways, and I appreciate this post because it's just the info that you need with some other unique facts. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. That is flower plant parts. After this, we're diving into the inner plant. Hope everybody's good, and thanks for listening.